Good afternoon and welcome to the Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting for September 26, 2011. Welcome everyone that's here in the audience and watching on Channel 16 or siouxfalls.org. We will start our meeting with City Council open discussion, and first of all I would just speak for Council Chair Aguilar, who is in town but is out on council business this afternoon, and so we'll work ahead without her and wish her well. Anything for council open discussion this afternoon? Councilor Jamieson.
Well, I might start this off with breaking the ice on the whole firing of Deborah Owen issue. And I just want us to start thinking about how we're going to restructure this to set up some guidelines, almost like standard operating procedures for an employee of ours to work here. You know, what rules do they follow? What constitutes dismissal? You know, if anybody were to come and apply for this position, a chief of staff position, that's accountable to all 8 of us, I think it's only fair that they know exactly what the rules are. So I just want us to start thinking about that, and I don't know how to do it yet. And even going further, when that employee is working for us, what method do we go to dismiss a person like that? What procedures do we follow? I just think we need to start setting up some guidelines here sooner than later so that when we do reach out to try to find this person, they know what to expect coming in so that we can capture some applicants and get this thing back on track, so to speak. So I don't know what the method is or who should decide these standard operating procedures or guidelines for this employee to follow, but somehow we've got to start. We haven't talked about it in an open way, excuse me, but I think we almost got to in order to get past this. So I'm just kind of breaking the ice on the topic. We've got to get it started. I would sure like to be a part of that process. I think Councilor Brown was here back in the day when we started it with Deborah, or this position. So I think he's got some great leadership. Hopefully we don't have to repeat all those steps that we've gone through, but it appears we've got to set a foundation on how to get it built again. So I would encourage Councilor Brown to participate, but I'm not going to include anybody, but I sure would volunteer my time. That's all.
Any other questions or comments for Councilor Jamieson? Councilor Brown?
I would be interested in that process going forward, but I'm wondering what kind of a timeline, if we have one yet, what our game plan is. Michelle, has leadership discussed that at all?
Leadership has briefly discussed it. We're looking at kind of an ad hoc committee. Some of us, those of us that are interested in participating. The other thing that we were looking at is bringing in maybe some folks from the community in terms of maybe from an HR perspective and maybe people with maybe some government experience. And so we'll certainly be looking to council to guide us in who those folks might be and take your lead on how that would go together. We are looking at, Councilor Aguilar will be out of town next week, and then the week after I think we'll start putting that plan together. So certainly looking for input in terms of how that group might come together. So I appreciate that, Councilor Jameson.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The only other thing I would add is that there is strong public interest in how we go about that process. And in fact, I've had calls from former council members who are very interested in being part of that conversation. And so I just would ask that we do that in a very public way and seek that sort of feedback from those beyond myself that were here when the position was started.
Right, good. Thank you, Councilor Brown. Other comments on that topic? Other topics for open discussion?
I do have one more, I'm sorry.
Yes, Councilor Brown.
I just wanted to let you know that next week Fiscal Committee will be discussing the proposal from the county commissioners regarding the fairgrounds. A few of us went on the tour. Kenny was there, Greg was there, Dean was there. We went on a tour of the fairgrounds to see sort of the shape of the buildings and had a discussion with them. And the County Commission is invited to come to this fiscal committee next week too. So if you're available at 5 o'clock, rest of the members, I would encourage you to be here because we'd like to hear your feedback as well.
Good, thank you. Councilor Rolfing.
Just wanted to let everybody know that the Land Use Committee has a busy agenda following this meeting. Zoning amendments, manufactured home park ordinance, another zoning amendments with ATVs and urban agriculture. So if you're wanting to stay, we'll have some interesting things to discuss.
Good, thanks, Councilor Rolfing. Any other open discussion? I have a couple of items, basically housekeeping things. Number one, a reminder to all council members that if you are attending something that is a potential public event, please let clerks know about it. You know that they have that group address. Send them an email. Let them know the date, the time, and the location of the event that you're attending so that it can be noticed publicly in case of a potential quorum. And so I just invite you to professional courtesy kind of thing with clerks on that issue. And then the other thing is that because Councilor Aguilar will be out of town this week, I do need someone to go with me if you're interested in attending the leadership meetings that we traditionally do on Thursday mornings. Councilor Karski, you're interested. We can have up to 3 of us go along, so let me know afterwards if you're interested in attending. We'll meet at City Hall Thursday morning. Any other open discussion? Seeing none, we'll move ahead with our presentations this afternoon. We begin with internal audit reports on police cash handling and the Arena and Orpheum Theater by Rich Oaksall, our lead internal auditor. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. Rich Oaksall from Internal Audit. We'll start with the shorter of the 2 reports. You should have a hard copy at your desk there. The Police Department cash handling audit. We do a lot of these cash handling audits because we feel they're important because cash is very vulnerable to misappropriation, and so we like to at least get one of those every year on our audit plan. We had a number of audit recommendations on this, which begin on page 4 of your report, and a little unusual that we had agreement from management on all of our recommendations on this audit report. So we're pleased about that. We don't often get that, but we were very happy about that. Several audit findings dealt with the sales tax, for example, not charging the correct amount, using the old 5.92%, and it's supposed to be the 6%. And then several cases where they were charging sales tax on various items, and they're not supposed to under state law. So we had recommendations to kind of clear up the sales tax issues. And then we did have an issue with agreement for allowing the public to look at an accident report online, not having to go down to the police headquarters and get an accident report like in the old days. Insurance companies like this feature very much, where they can get an accident report online. They pay more for this, but it's very convenient for them. The problem was with the vendor that provides that service, DocView. The police department entered into an agreement with DocView for this service, but that did not go through the city attorney's office or the purchasing office. And I believe that was back in 2007. It was a number of years ago. And based on the volume of business that they do, it reaches that point where it should have been probably gone out for bid on that. I think there's more than one company that provides that service. And then it should have gone through the city attorney's office and the purchasing office. So those are just some of the highlights on that cash handling audit. And as I said, the recommendations were agreed to by management, and many of them are already being implemented. So we're pleased about that. So if there's any questions about that particular audit, I'd be happy to answer those.
Questions for Rich? Yes, Councilor Brown.
How does the city department not charge the city tax? How does that happen?
Well, they, it's just, I think it was a case of where they were charging the tax and they weren't supposed to. For example, on the accident reports.
Actually, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the 5.9.
Oh, the 5.9 is supposed to be 6%.
Yeah.
And you know, if it's a small amount, that it's the same amount. I mean, I think there's a threshold, if something is like $5 or $6, it doesn't make any difference.
Right.
But really, it should be, when we changed the ordinance, I think in 2009, we need to get the word out to the departments so that they know to charge the 6%. So we'd ask the finance to work with the departments, and I think they're doing that to just make sure that we have all the places in the city where we collect sales tax, that we've got the right amount, and that we're not collecting when we're not supposed to. So it's just kind of a housekeeping issue.
Yeah, it's disappointing, though, because I can't imagine what we'd do to a local business that didn't do the same, or that did the same.
Yeah. So that's kind of the value of internal audits. Somebody looks at that stuff periodically, and we kind of catch those things and clean them up. So,
Other questions on this one? Seeing none, go right ahead, Rich.
okay, the next audit we had was it was compliance audit of the contract that we have with SMG to manage the arena, the Sioux Falls Arena, and the Orpheum Theater downtown. It's both facilities are under one agreement, and this agreement will continue through December of next year. In other words, until the end of December 2012. And overall, we found that SMG is managing the arena and the Orpheum Theater in compliance with the agreement. We did have a number of recommendations. I'd like to point out several. On page 8, recommendation 4, the management fee is $50,000, and we recommend that be rebated back to the city. It had to do with the definition of break even. According to the agreement, if they don't break even, then they have to rebate that $50,000 back to the city dollar for whatever the amount of the deficit was. It was the understanding of the management company, SMG, and the city that break even actually referred to how they compared to what they were projected to do. They were projected to have a deficit of, I believe, $153,000, and the deficit was only $93,000. So they weren't in the red as much as the budget would indicate. So they mutually agreed that they would be allowed to have that $50,000 management fee. So our point was that the dictionary definition of break even is as you see in the report, that revenue equals expenses. There wasn't any defining language within the agreement, so we would recommend it for future agreements. It would be helpful if you have terms like break even to be very specific about the definition if you're not using the common definition. There was an opportunity for improvement. Actually, number 7 on page 14, it had to do with the ticket fee. It's called the Public Facility Maintenance Surcharge, and we recommended that apply to all tickets. It's under a tier system, so that the more expensive the ticket is, the more that fee rises. And the original purpose of that surcharge was to maintain public facilities. It's just sort of a tax or a fee upon the face value of the ticket. The problem was with those comp tickets. In some events, there's a lot of comp tickets, and the city is losing some revenue because that maintenance surcharge is not being assessed on those comp tickets. And then that maintenance surcharge does not apply to facilities, city-owned facilities that are less than 2,500 seats. So, for example, the Pavilion or the Orpheum don't have that assessed. It applied to the baseball stadium, to events at the arena or the convention center. So probably going forward from this point, it'd probably be something that we may have to look at, maybe through fiscal committee, looking at that ordinance, what the original purpose was back in the 80s. Do we need to just get rid of that? I know when we spoke with management, Terry Torkelson, there's arguments to be made of not assessing that maintenance surcharge. Yeah, I guess it's going forward, we probably need to look at that ordinance again. And then also the deal with the comp tickets, with the free tickets. Do we have a policy on the comp tickets? Do we limit to the number of comp tickets? It's something that's done in the industry, and it's something we need to look at. So, and one thing we also noticed was we had made mention of the contract monitoring being rather lax. Mike Cooper's here, and he has a checklist that he might speak to you for a minute about. It's a way of improving the contract monitoring side. Mike, if you want to talk about that checklist.
Thank you. Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services. I did hand out a copy, which is a little hard to read. Once we received this audit, and then this really goes back to the audit that was done on the convention center contract compliance as well. We felt that it would be in the best interest of everybody to have an internal compliance team, which would be finance, attorneys, and planning staff. So we put together this checklist, which I gave you. On one side is the SMG, on the back side would be the global spectrum. But essentially what we've done is we've split this up into specific tasks on the left-hand column, who the responsible party is, the frequency, if it's quarterly, yearly, monthly, and then each quarter when we get together, we're going to do a checklist to make sure that whatever has to be done has been done, along with any additional comments. So this is a follow-up to, again, not only the internal audit that was done previously of the convention center, but also the one that you're reviewing today of the arena. And we think this will help our internal process as well as the contractors that we have.
So I think that's part of the value of internal audit. Our purpose is to make things better, and I think that having the checklist and having a compliance team will help the process to make it make sure things don't fall through the cracks and make sure things are done right. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer. We have Terry Torkelson from SMG and his team here as well. So
Questions from council? Councilor Rolfing?
I want to congratulate you on putting this together. I know this has been a little lax area in the past, and this
well,
should...
I didn't do the checklist, but
I know,
it came as a result of our...
Mike, this is good. This
Yeah.
because of this, and this is this will really help. I think everyone stay on track and keep everything going well. And so, Terry, I assume that you're okay with this. Yeah, because this will help you too, so there won't be any question about what's happening and where the money is and what's going on, and it'll be good for everybody. So I just wanted to say thank you for putting this together. That's great. Thank you.
Councilor Antoman?
I do have, Rich, if you don't mind. Mike, I do have a question. I notice on this sheet, I think this is a great checklist too, but I do notice in a couple of areas, for example, a couple of things through previous audits that we had were like insurance compliance as far as additional insured, things being listed as additional insured. I noticed that those things are not on this sheet. I was wondering if we couldn't maybe take a look at this and maybe expand on this just a little bit more. I think the concept that you have here is great. And I'd actually, the question that I would have for everyone then, is this a sheet that can be applied then to other city-owned facilities? And I think this is a great start for that. I think this is one of those things that we have been requesting.
I think we have a number of these contracts, and I think as we work out the bugs, we can expand that to other public facilities. Yeah.
Just the legality, since you've got a team lined up to look at this on an annual basis anyway, I think those compliance issues are things that we do need to address too. Thank you.
Okay.
Good, thank you. Other questions for Rich or for the team?
Okay, thank you.
I do have one question, Rich, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Regarding recommendation 4 in particular,
Yeah.
when we're talking about asking for a rebate, we very often don't seem to enforce our audit recommendations. How do we go about making that happen?
Well, since it's a situation where the management company they've discussed it with the city, and the administration's position was that they both agreed that this was the definition. So unless the city council were to, I guess, we make our recommendation. We think it should be rebated. However, both the administration and the management company had agreed that this is what break-even meant. So there's not much I can do as an internal auditor other than say this is what I think it should be. We've had issues with, for example, we were just talking about the credit card fees with the convention center audit, and I think we're making progress on that. I just talked to Mike before the meeting about that, and that was a substantial amount of dollars, and I think we're coming to a conclusion on that one. But when there's a disagreement on the definition of what this means, and both the city and the management company agree that this is what it means, I don't know where we're at that point. So.
Okay, good. Thank you, Rich. I do have a question then for Mr. Cooper, if I might, real quick.
Yes.
Several things in this audit are things that we need to look at when that agreement expires in December 2012. Is this something that, I mean, as a council member, do I need to hang on to it and make sure that we follow up on those contracts in that discussion, or is this something that you're going to take into effect or take into account when we're in those conversations?
We will take this forward with that process of entering into new contracts. Again, both the arena and the convention center expire at the end of next year. And so the intent is going to be do one RFP for both facilities. Finance is also going to be helping lead that process so that it's as transparent as possible. And I think you'll see that the process that we're going to use next year is going to be vastly different than what we did last time. We're even talking about bringing in a third party to help us develop the process, which I think will be even more beneficial. And I don't know if Tracy wants to comment about that, but to make a quick answer to your question, yes, we are going to take both of these audits and incorporate that into the process for next time.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
I know that I can't speak for council as a whole, but I have heard rumblings that council is very interested in how that process goes.
Yes,
So,
because that's going to be a pretty big
yes,
agreement
yes.
for those two facilities
Exactly.
next year.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I
And I don't
appreciate
want to be the only one having to make the decision. So,
Good
okay.
plan.
And I won't be. So.
it. Thank you. Other questions from council members? Councilor Entman.
Just a comment here. I think that this report, along with some previous reports that we had concerning our different city-owned facilities, do bring up some points with these contracts. As far as the definitions that you've
Yeah.
talked about, we've had that before on
Yeah.
a couple of these other reports,
It's been an
too.
overarching theme. It's helpful as auditors if we have a term that's a common term, that if we define that very precisely, it helps, I think, everybody. And then we found in this contract, too, I think the contract was entered into in 2010, but it wasn't until, I think, January of 11 when SMG had the conversation with the city, okay, what does this mean? And when you're sort of well into the contract, it would have been good maybe to have that conversation before the contract was entered
Yeah,
into.
and
I think
that's
that helps everybody, auditors, it helps the management company, everybody understands exactly what we're talking about.
And that's a good point, Rich. And I would hope that we do look at that. In fact, I'm going to expect that those contracts, as they're entered into new contracts, that those definitions are in there.
It also helps,
I would
too,
hope that we
for
see
example, when reports are required, if they have a due date. So if they ask the SMG to have a certain report done, if they say this is to be done by April 1st and it's to be turned into this person or this office, I think that helps a lot. So,
Thank you.
Exactly. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Sharkelson, please come forward if you'd like. Yes, thank you. Not usually, but we'll let you.
General Manager, Sioux Falls Arena. In fact, there was a conversation prior to the signing of the contract. It was an email one between Joe Romano, our Senior Regional Vice President, and Karen Leonard, the person putting the contract together, on what the definition of that term was. So that we re-clarified it in January when we were going through what we had to supply and to make sure, okay, now this still stands. So we can provide that data if you want, but it was discussed prior to the execution of the contract.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Hearing nothing else, we'll move on. Thank you very much, Rich. We appreciate your work. Moving on to the August monthly financial report from Tracy Turbeck, Director of Finance.
Good afternoon. Councilor Erpenbach, members of the council, Tracy Turbeck with the Finance Office. Seems like I was just here to give one of these not too long ago. Here we are again. Months roll around pretty quickly, it seems. The The monthly financial report for the end of August did go out to the council. I believe it was on the 20th of September. You folks, as you know, all receive an electronic copy. Just for your own information, that report is also posted on the city website and is maintained out there. We've got several years' worth of monthly reports out there as well, so that's available to the public. They just need to find their way to the finance office page within the city's website. This month, we do continue to see some positive indications of what's happening in our local economy. There are a number of positive trends in our local economic data that we do track, and I think there are, for that reason, there are reasons to be optimistic about our local economy here in the Sioux Falls area. Now, that does stand in stark contrast to what you see on the evening news about the local, or about the national economy and kind of the national headlines in terms of economic data, but I do think it is important to underscore that we are not Washington, D.C. here. We're not the East Coast or the West Coast, and I think if you look at regional data, economic data, you'll see that there's a pretty good swath through the middle of the country that is faring much better than what you see on the East Coast or the West Coast or down south in Texas and Florida and so forth. But so that's just important kind of to keep that in mind as a backdrop as we look at some of this economic data. Get my little clicker to work here. The slides I have for you today are quite similar to what we've been looking at the past number of months. The first one, first one is on the statistical area unemployment data. The rate has, and these are, the green line reflects the current year 2011. The data, last data point for 2011 is for the month of July. You can see that has continued to go down. And we ended July at a 4.2% unemployment rate in the Sioux Falls area. That compares with a 9.3% national unemployment rate and a South Dakota state rate of slightly higher of 4.5%. I should also point out that one of the jobs statistics that we track are the number of people employed. We pull this information off the state's website, the non-farm wage and salaried workers from a year ago in July, from July of 2010 to July of 2011, has increased by 1,900 jobs. So that's I think an important number as well, although it's not growing at the rate we might like to see. It is certainly, the needle is moving in the right direction, and we are seeing some improvement in that. You can see on this chart that throughout 2009, the unemployment rate locally hovered around 5%. For 2010, started at slightly over 6%, fell fairly consistently throughout the year, ending the year up a little bit off its low at just under 5%. So at 4.2% currently, we are compare very favorably to where we were a year ago and certainly 2 years ago. The next slide reflects building permit values, the value of permits issued. These are monthly figures, so you can see that the lines jump around quite a bit. Again, the chart reflects 3 years, almost 3 years of data, 2009, 2010, and then through August of 2011. Important, I think, to understand in terms of the construction, that is one area of the local economy that has been lagging in terms of recovering to pre-recession levels. We've seen this continue to improve, and in fact, currently as of the end of August, year to date, we're running ahead of last year and ahead of 2009 as of the end of August on a year-to-date basis. Now, from 2 years ago, we're actually running almost 15% ahead of 2009, but of course that was quite a dismal year in the local economy. We saw some recovery last year in 2010. We're running a little bit more than 0.5% on a year-to-date basis ahead of 2010 in terms of the value of building permits issued. So we are seeing that sector. Looks like it's coming around. We're picking up a little bit of steam, and hopefully that will continue for the rest of the year. The next key economic indicator, of course, that we look at is sales tax collections. That the city's financial bread and butter really is the 2% city sales tax that we levy. This chart reflects the first penny, our general sales tax, and again, we look at 2009, 10, and year-to-date through 11. The blue line, of course, is for 2009, shows that it started out to be a bad year and got worse as the year went on. 2010 improved considerably. The red line, of course, we started out at a high monthly growth rate due to some large audit collections earlier in the year, and ended the year with a 3.8% overall growth in 2010. Now for 2011, it's been increasing gradually throughout the year, and again, these growth rates reflect, do include the audit collections that you've heard me talk about in the past. Without the audit collections, of course, it's quite a bit different story, and I've got my next slide on that. The year-to-date so far, including all of the audit adjustments and everything, is at 1.8% growth from January through August, and that's been suppressed by a large negative audit adjustment or audit deduction in our collections that we saw in the month of June. If we strip those audit adjustments out and the additional collections we occasionally get from audits, as well as deductions that as that one that occurred in June, we take those away, and I think get a clearer picture of where our taxable sales are trending. This chart shows you a rolling 12-month growth rate, so we look, each data point on there represents a 12-month period of time and the growth that occurred in that year versus the prior year. And you can see that throughout 2009 and 2010, that year-over-year growth rate was very, very sluggish in the negative territory through much of that time. We saw that pick up throughout the last half of 2010, and is currently through August growing at a rate of 5%. So that's holding in a very solid position for a 12-month growth rate. So I think with the picture we're seeing on the unemployment rate, that's at 4.2% locally. The building construction, the valuation is now running ahead of last year, and with the very, very solid 5% growth rate that we're seeing in our year-over-year adjusted sales tax figures, I think there are reasons certainly to be optimistic about our local economy in spite of the national headlines that I referred to. My last slide will look just briefly at the general fund, the year-to-date revenue and expenditure figures. The bottom line is the revenue collections for the year and the expenditures that we've made through August are tracking very much in line with our budget. We are at 61% of budget for our revenues. So in other words, we've realized 61% of the revenues that we've budgeted for the year. That's the revenues are up about $2.2 million over this point last year, or about 3.3%. So we're seeing good growth in our revenues, primarily in our sales tax revenues as well as property tax revenues. On the expenditure side, we're at about 63% of budget. Our expenditures are up about $1.1 million over a year ago, so about half of what our revenues have increased, and that's about a 1.5% growth rate in our expenditures, tracking very much in line with our budget. With that, I'd be happy to try to address any questions that the council may have.
Questions for Director Turbeck?
Gonna let me off easy?
Getting you off easy, yeah.
Wow.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your help. Moving along to the Board of Health Rabies Resolution Update by Alicia Kalura and Jill Franken.
Good afternoon, Jill Franken, Health Director. I will try and be brief in my presentation today, but I do have a few things to cover regarding rabies vaccination. I'd like to start off by thanking Alicia from our office, Kalura, Assistant Health Director, for working on this. She started working heavily with the Board of Health on this right after she was appointed to the Assistant Director position So it was one of our first projects to really get fully immersed in when it comes to the public health side of the work that we do. Kyle Hoekstra, Sergeant from the Police Department and Animal Control, also was very helpful. And then, of course, thank you to our Board of Health for all the work that they did in pulling this together. So just to get started, by way of introduction, just want to go through a couple of pieces as to why it's so important that we are monitoring rabies, vaccinating against rabies, and have a program in place for that. Obviously, rabies is still alive and well in our nation and in our state, and it is a fatal virus that causes encephalitis if you are contracted with rabies and exposed to it. So it certainly is a serious public health problem that we need to mitigate as much as possible. In 2009, there were over 6,000 cases nationally, and in 2010, there were 32 cases of animal rabies reported in South Dakota, just to give you a little background. One of the things that I have this slide up for to show you is just that we do get regular reports from the South Dakota Department of Health on a regular basis throughout the year, and then annually we get reports aggregating the data of what's going on with rabies in our state and then by county. And so the reason I show you this is that anytime we would make a change or a resolution changing our vaccination within the city limits, this can be a valuable tool to be able to help us see, are we seeing a respective change to what is going on in the Minnehaha and then as well as Lincoln County within the city limits, and work with the State Department of Health if there's anything that we need to be paying attention to. Just so you know, between 2007 and 2010, there was actually only one case of rabies in a cat or a dog, and that was in a cat in 2010. So that's really pretty good when you look at the rest of the state. I also, just to let you know, that it is by ordinance the responsibility of the Department of Health to set the vaccination schedule, and they take that role very seriously, and we'll share more of that information with you here. So what happened was, prior to 2007, the rabies vaccination was on a really standard schedule. It was a yearly requirement to vaccinate your dog or your cat, and then also licensing accompanied that. And in 2007, the CDC had actually updated their information through a compendium that they provided to folks that deal with this issue. And it was, at that time, because of the compendium, which acknowledged more than just annual vaccination, acknowledged that there is multi-year vaccination out there, that it's effective, that it is works for the length of time, and you're able to see immunization for the length of time that those vaccines are being provided for. So therefore, in 2007, the Board of Health did change the vaccination requirement. Took a conservative approach, however, and did change it so that every 2 years, if you're using a multi-year vaccination, that's every 2 years you have to have your dog vaccinated. If you're using an annual vaccine, then you'd still have to do it annually. And then they decided to keep the approach of annual vaccination for cats at that time. This was certainly a positive first step to at least acknowledge the CDC's recommendations and what they're putting out in their compendium, but it was just a first step. So then in 2011, really asked the Board of Health to review that resolution and consider if they still feel like that's a valid resolution or if they'd like to make any changes to it. So simply state, we concur that this is still a good resolution, or we would like to make some changes. They did, after much discussion, much research, did make those changes, and just at their last board meeting, did approve a resolution for rabies vaccination booster schedule after the first year vaccination period. So now it does fall in line with the CDC's compendium that says for every 3-year vaccination required for dogs and cats when a multi-year vaccine is used. And if an annual vaccine is used, you must have your dog or your cat vaccinated yearly. Why did this change take place? One of the reasons was we do get periodic concerns from pet owners and folks in the community, as well as we had some concerns from some of our board members who are more involved with animal care, as well as we always try to have a veterinarian serve on our board. That's a local veterinarian. They will come to us and say we probably should be making some changes, and they're concerned about over-vaccination of pets in the community. So those were really some of the reasons that I asked them to just regard that resolution in the first place early this year, but also that the vaccination intervals no longer, when you look at the current guidelines, our vaccination of every 2 years requirement was really no longer in sync with those recommendations. So there's certainly pros and cons to making a resolution change like this, because we don't want to cause issues with people having a knowledge base about what's the proper way to be vaccinating your pet. And so certainly what this does in a positive way is it does allow a pet owner and a veterinarian to determine, should we be using an annual vaccination or a multi-year vaccination? And it does leave it up to the discretion and judgment of the veterinarian to be making that decision in partnership with the pet owner. It also is in line with the latest scientific findings and guidelines, and then also some communities that we have talked to that have gone to utilizing the CDC's following the product label and the product guidelines has actually increased vaccine compliance. So the negative to this certainly is this, when we make this type of change, it then leads to a change that's necessary on the licensing side, and I'll speak more to that in just a little bit. But that is something that then we have to work hand in hand with. So while this is a resolution on behalf of the Board of Health, it then becomes an action that you all have to be brought before you to regard. It also requires, working with educating the veterinarians in the community as well as pet owners to make sure there's no confusion that's occurred, and we do have a plan to manage that. So we looked at national guidance, and we did reach validation and see plenty of support through the CDC that I've mentioned, the Compendium for Animal Rabies, as well as the American Animal Hospital Association and the American Association of Feline Practitioners. So we did reach and find much support for what we're doing here. Next, we also looked at our expert opinions around the state and locally, and Dr. Dustin Odekoven, the state veterinarian in Pierre, recommends booster interval in accordance with product guidelines and similar to what our resolution is providing. And also Dr. Russ Daly is here, and I'm going to ask him to come up and just say a couple comments. He is the Extension Veterinarian Associate Professor of State Public Health Veterinarian, actually, for SDSU, and he also has some positive comments to make about our resolution. But while he's coming up, I would like to just also mention that we did send a letter out to all the veterinarians in the community, asking them, sharing with them what the draft resolution was going to be, and asking them if they would like to provide comment to us. And we did receive some comment and feedback back that we brought in to the discussion and took under consideration as we put this resolution together. So with that, I'd like to have Dr. Daly just make a couple comments, please. It's okay if I just say that, sit there.
Thank you. As Jill mentioned, I am Dr. Russ Daly. I'm the, in addition to serving as extension vet at SDSU, I'm also serving as state public health veterinarian. And I am in favor of the resolution that Jill mentioned about rabies vaccination is important, not only to prevent animals from getting rabies, but you also have to realize that if an animal bites, a domestic animal bites a child or a person in the community, whether that animal is vaccinated for rabies or not makes a big difference on how that animal is dealt with. The compendium that Jill mentioned, it actually is formulated through a parent organization that I belong to, the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians, and it is the Bible that we use as veterinarians, not just on a statewide level, but on a clinic-by-clinic level too. And I think the best thing about this resolution is it does eliminate a source of confusion for pet owners and veterinarians, and that whatever a veterinarian has determined is appropriate to give that animal, that's what your ordinances will be lined up for. And I do appreciate your support of this resolution.
Thank you, Dr. Daly. Okay, then we also looked at other communities and what's happening, and I'm not going to go into these at length, but suffice it to say, there are many, many communities that are actually following the product guidelines and administering and then resolving in their local communities as well as in states to follow the compendium as it was written. So there's one town, and that's Watertown, that is doing every 2-year vaccination, and Alicia did have conversation with them, and while they're perfectly satisfied with their every 2-year vaccination schedule, they said they fully, say that, 3 years is really very, for a multi-year vaccine, 3 years is the way to go as well. It's just they have not really the impetus at this time to do any changes to theirs, but they certainly were supportive of the idea that we were looking at that. So we did check with what's going on in other communities as well. So next steps. When we look at the next steps, we have to look now, as I mentioned before, at the licensing piece. And our aim, when we're looking at rabies vaccination as well as licensing, it's to obtain maximum rabies vaccination coverage in Sioux Falls to minimize rabies exposure. So our objective is that licensing of dogs and cats will coincide, or is to coincide with rabies vaccination. And that's a long-standing process that we've had, and it's not only long-standing for our Sioux Falls community. We certainly didn't just pull that one out without a basis for how we came up with that. It's really, there's several reasons for that, and I've got them listed here. First off, it's just critical that when an officer is going out and dealing with an animal, that they can see quickly if it's tagged, then they know that their rabies vaccination is current, so they can manage that animal differently than if they don't see a tag and don't see a current tag, maybe sometimes is the case. And then it's also the ease of the owners to coordinate both activities. You can get your rabies vaccination, get your license. They do that right there at the vet's office very easily, and so that's really a convenience for our citizens of Sioux Falls. And then, of course, it's really the prevailing standard. It's listed out in that compendium specifically, the importance of tying your license to your rabies vaccination schedule. So just for those reasons, we continue to encourage that. So this is the proposed license and fee changes we're just sharing with you on behalf of Animal Control and the Police Department, since this all ties together, just rounding out our presentation here. What you can see here is that the Animal Control staff and Police Department has pulled together a 1- and 3-year type of license that they will issue, and they've got all the procedures in place to be able to do that. They're going to, I think it's different colored tags and things of that nature that they'll do, so they can see that they're indeed tagged, they're indeed current, but they may have a 1- or 3-year license. And they didn't change the rate of the fee. They just, where it was a 2-year license fee before, now it's either half of that for a 1 year, or again, a larger amount, so where it was $50 perhaps for an unneutered pet prior, it's now, if you wanted, that was for 2 years, it would be $75 for 3 years. So it isn't an increased cost per year for that license, it's just the upfront cost might be a little bit more, but then you have it for an extra year. So that's what we have that will be coming to you. And I know Patty Lyon is here, and she was going to come forward and talk a little bit about some additional changes that are perhaps a little bit more housekeeping as it related to the animal control ordinance. But then lastly, just to let you know from a timeline perspective, we're going to bring the first reading on all this between our departments on October 3rd, and then second reading will be on October 11th. And at that time, I'll turn it over to Patty to finish up, and then we can answer any questions you might have.
Good afternoon, Patty Lyon, Assistant Chief. Thanks, Jill and Alicia and Sergeant Kyle Hookstra for their work on the ordinance change and the Board of Health as well. Basically, Jill covered most of our presentation with her PowerPoint. There's a few housekeeping measures that we are taking with the ordinance changes. The most significant one is in 7-24, which is involving impounding for observation. This ordinance is being changed to reflect when a dog, cat, or other animal bites a person off of the premises of the owner. So let's say in the past, in the way the ordinance is currently worded, if your pet is vaccinated and up to date, and you're walking the dog, and you're half a block away from home, and it bites a child or another person that's in the vicinity, right now we currently have to quarantine that animal at the shelter for 10 days. And the homeowner has to pay the fees of $8 a day for boarding and $30 for impound. So it's $110. We're recommending changing that based on the observations of and the discretion of the animal control officer. If the home is in a good environment, it's a safe environment, we're recommending that they impound at the home itself. So it'd be a 10-day quarantine at home. This is probably the most significant change in our ordinance here. The other changes are minor again. Some were recommended by our audit. In 7-45, we added the term $8 per day for boarding fees. The next significant change is in 7-52 under injured animals. We're adding the term suffered or suffering or otherwise diseased. We have animals that get turned into the Humane Society that are injured as well as maybe diseased. And technically, we have to wait 3 days to euthanize them if they're suffering from a disease. And we would like to just add, if an animal is suffering from a disease but they're not specifically injured, to allow euthanization for those animals that are suffering. So that's just a very minor change to the ordinance. Other changes are basically a lot of the things that were discussed by Jill as far as adding language regarding the costs of the licensing. That wasn't added in our original ordinances, and now we are adding those. You have any questions? I have Sergeant Kyle Hookstra here, who could probably give you a lot more detail than me.
Thank you, Patty. Questions? Counselor Anderson?
Yes, on the 7-45, where you're talking about the suffering, diseased animal, who's going to make that determination? Would that be a vet that's part of the process, or is that going to be animal control, the Humane Society?
It could be any one of those. When we encounter an animal right now that's injured, like let's say a deer, our animal control officers and our police officers have the discretion in putting that animal down because we don't want it to suffer. Sergeant Hoekstra maybe could explain that further.
Kyle Hoekstra, Sergeant of the Sioux Falls Police Department. Basically, in a situation like that, let's say that the animal control officer goes to an injured animal. If it's injured to the extent where they need medical care, they do take it to the emergency vet. Basically, what we look at is if the animal can remain comfortable. Obviously, that's what we'll do for the 3-day period as ordinance. But if a vet says it can't be made comfortable, that's where the decision would be made to euthanize the animal in that situation. But with the suffering and the disease, there's times where they will run across an animal that is obviously diseased and obviously suffering. It's not injured, but I guess the right thing to do is, put that animal out of its misery.
Counselor Karski?
I guess I have two questions, if I may. First of all, on the basically the house arrest for the animal that we're talking about, putting them under, does that mean the owner can't take the animal out for a walk for 10 days? I mean, is it really an enforceable ordinance change? Is there really any meaning to it?
Basically, let's say where it's at right now, a bite happens on property. If the animal's current and everything looks good at the house, they'll do a 10-day in-home quarantine. They'll give them a form which explains they can't take the dog out in the public, because it's underneath the quarantine. You have to limit exposure to people coming in the house, all those sorts of things. If
let's say 5 days down the line that you get a call there and that dog is out in public, then there's enforceable things that can be taken. It would be actually taken at that point, and then the quarantine remainder would be up to Humane Society.
So the quarantine is to observe the animal, basically, and the owner has the ability to know what they're observing for, basically?
Yes, basically when they would do a 10-day in-home quarantine, they make a scheduled activity. 5 days into that, animal control will go to that house and they'll take a look at the dog, make sure that everything's going well with the dog. And then at the 10th day, there'll be also another scheduled activity. Animal control will go look at the dog, make sure everything's the way it should be. Then they request with that form that the person brings the animal into the vet for one checkup, just to ensure that the quarantine went well.
Okay. And a second question involves the licensing fees, if I could. Any sort of magical formula, Jill, for determining, the neutered versus non-neutered? Not to sound like Bob Barker, I guess, but, I look at the need to neuter and spay animals, and most of the time the reason they're not neutered is for commercial purposes, for breeding and, puppies and selling.
I guess where they came up with those amounts, it was back in 2007 that I think those amounts were in place. And I guess where they came up with those specific amounts, I guess I'm not sure. The brief research that I did is there's a lot of jurisdictions that it's much higher for a non-neutered animal.
And I guess that's what I'm wondering is it enough on the non-neutered animals? Are we appropriate in our charge there?
I guess that, there's the line where you have somebody that will say use the animal for breeding, would feel that, anything above and beyond that would be too much. Obviously, on our end of it, we want animals spayed and neutered, so you want it to be enough where someone will hopefully get that done. So I guess that's the balance that we look at.
Okay. Well, might be something to talk about a little bit more, but thank you.
Councilor Anderson.
Question for Jill. With these ordinance changes and everything, we've been specifically talking about dog and cats. Recently, it's come to our attention about more exotic or farm animals also. Do we have ordinances or something to cover those type of animals also?
Well, what you look for is those animals that are susceptible to rabies is what I know we have written in our ordinance. And so we haven't looked into whether or not, I'm assuming you're talking about things like, some of the farm animals that are...
I've seen chickens, goats,
Sure,
pot-bellied
sure.
pigs.
Sure, and it would be for those animals that would be susceptible to rabies. So that's certainly something we should take a look at as we look forward to additional changes that we might need to be making, but...
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Entman.
Jill, I noticed you did make a notice here that you did inform us that you did send letters to all the vets in the area. And you notified them then, I'm taking of what the ordinance changes were going to be, the fee schedule change and those kinds of things. And you said you did receive some comments. Can you share with us some of the comments that you received, please?
Sure. Two of the comments were really, I think we received three comments back. Two were really just clarification, just wanting to know more about the change, the changes and how we came to those changes, and more related to making sure that we were paying attention to how there are cancers that can be developed in cats from over-vaccination, so really paying attention to that and sort of more advocating that this is a good decision to make. And then one was actually from a former board member, veterinary board member, just making sure that we're really, he just wanted to, once again, make sure we just really pay attention to those multi-year schedules and really he wants us to make sure we're taking as conservative approach as possible. But we also know that this is just we've really vetted this through many, many different sources, so we took that under advisement but he was just once again making sure we're always being very conservative. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Councilor Brown.
Jill, referencing Councilor Anderson's question, farm animals by ordinance can't be in the city, correct?
We have, there is no specific ordinance that and this might almost be more for Mike to answer, so it's a good thing he's here, because there is something related, it's more under the zoning issues than it is under our ordinance. So.
And Councilor Brown, that's a great preview to the Land Use Committee meeting coming up. Thanks for the segue.
Come on, Mike, I want to hear
Shauna,
about your chicken farm.
Come
Get up
give us a preview and update here.
Okay, a little preview. That we do have zoning districts that do allow agriculture-type uses in the city limits. Agriculture is a lot of things, from growing crops to keeping of animals. So, yes, we do allow the keeping of certain animals, and what makes livestock and what is not livestock, stay tuned, because we're going to be talking about urban agriculture at the Land Use Committee. Does that answer your question?
Good, thanks, Shauna. Any other questions on this topic? Councilor Jameson.
Jill, I agree with your premise that your goal was to try to get as many animals vaccinated as possible. Did you include any members of the just general public on how the convenience of this would work for them or be a problem for them? Or
Well, actually, our Board of Health is made up of several members of the community, a couple of which really were Sylvia Thorson was very involved in this, and she's a general member of the community that helped us with this, and actually several other members. So we did feel like we had a pretty decent representation through our Board of Health.
Very good, thank you.
Well, if I might just add to that, I did have a citizen contact me over a year ago about this same idea of putting the licensing and the rabies vaccinations on the same schedule, especially when it's multi-year like that. So I appreciate the work you've all done. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Jill, and everybody else that was involved. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Any other comments or questions from council? If not, I'm looking for a motion to go into executive session.
So move, Anderson.
Councilor Anderson has moved that we go into executive session pursuant to SDCL 125-2, subsection 1, for personnel matters. Do I have a second?
Second, Entman.
Councilor Entman seconds. Thank you very much. We'll clear the room.